We're going to start with Jamie Gass, who is at the Pioneer Institute. He's the director of the Center for School Reform at the Pioneer Institute. In my notes, I say he's framed, commissioned, and managed over 60 research papers, numerous policy events on K-12 education reform topics. Jamie has more than 2 decades of experience in public administration and education and reform at the state, municipal, and school district levels. Before, he worked at the Massachusetts Office of Educational Quality and Accountability as a senior policy analyst and a technical writer, and in the state budget office under 2 Massachusetts governors. So without further ado, our first speaker, Mr. Jamie Gass.
So thank you, Mark, and I want to thank Helen, who I met just as I got here. I was really pleased to meet her because my oldest daughter, her name's Helen too. But Michael Gendry and a variety of other folks that have helped set up these kinds of events all over the state. We've done probably 40 or 50 of them in the last 9-10 months, and it's really been remarkable. So I want to just first of all begin by telling you what Common Core is, because the fact is that even though 40 some odd states have adopted, and that states are about 4 years into implementing the Common Core, the reality of it is that an enormous number of parents and people in the general public and state legislators, not just in Massachusetts, but across the country, really have no idea what this is. What Common Core is a set of national English and math standards. Standards are usually driven by states, and what they do is they articulate what it is to be taught at the various grade levels. It's a general framework of and the Common Core was developed by the National Governors Association, which represents the governors of each state, and the Council of Chief State School Officers, which represents the commissioners of education in each state. Now, it's important to emphasize that these organizations, they're Washington, D.C. based lobby groups, they don't represent states, right? They represent their membership, the governors and commissioners of each state. So one of the things you'll hear about Common Core is, well, it's state-led. Not really. It's D.C. lobby group led instead of states. And it's coupled with 2 national testing consortia which will develop tests that will be aligned with the Common Core. So in Massachusetts, and we're in the process of having this debate about whether we're going to get rid of MCAS, which has been our state test, and replace it with PARCC, which is one of the testing consortia. And then the other testing consortia is called the Smarter Balanced Testing Consortia. So Connecticut, Maine, New Hampshire are in Smarter Balanced. And the funding for the Common Core really came, $200 million for the development of it and the advocacy for it has come from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. You know who Bill Gates is. He was the founder of Microsoft. I think he's, a remarkable guy in terms of, microtechnology. He just doesn't happen to know much of anything about K-12 education. The funding for the 2 testing consortia came to the tune of about $360 million, and that came directly from the U.S. Department of Education, and there are some problems with that, what I'll talk about a little bit later. So I work for a place called Pioneer Institute. It's an independent think tank in Boston. We've been around for about 25 years or so. We've been one of the big drivers behind a lot of the education reform efforts going back to the was our first director, the current Secretary of Education, Jim Parker, executive director in the 90s. And we, genuinely speaking, really like to call it like we see it. We look at the facts and the research and the evidence and the from government, so we have a lot of independence. There's no deep-pocketed that's paying for the work that we're doing. We're doing it because it is the right thing to do, and on the merits of it, Common Core, from our point of view, has got some very, very serious problems. So to give you sort of some context, I'm going to kind of get you to the point where you'll understand why we're even having this conversation about national standards, about state standards, about academic performance. I want to kind of give you some context, some historical context to help lead in. And to do that, I'm going to begin with a quote from James Madison. He's called the father of the Constitution. He wrote the Bill of Rights, and he wrote this in 1792 about the governance structure under which we live. and I think that there's probably no greater authority, probably in the history of the country, on governance than James Madison. And he said this: "If Congress may establish teachers in every state, county, and parish, and pay them out of the public treasury, they may take into their own hands the education of children, establish in like manner schools to declare opinion, the very foundation and the very nature of the limited government established by the people of America." So, as I often say, the Founding Fathers were very far-sighted. They had a deep and thoroughgoing knowledge of history in order to frame our Constitution and our Bill of Rights. They looked from antiquity, Greece and Rome. They had all this experience as being Englishmen, all the things that they liked and didn't like about living as subjects under a king. And this, what they did in our Constitution, and it's really quite unique, not only in our time, but really going across history, is they really divided power between two separate kinds of governments. We have the national government, which does trade and foreign policy and defense, all of the big picture issues that have to do with the mostly the sort of outlook of the country toward the rest of the world, right? But that most of the issues that most intimately are connected with the lives of citizens, and in particular schooling, they left to the states and localities. The U.S. Constitution is virtually silent on the issue of K-12 education, whereas the state constitution, like the Massachusetts Constitution, which was written by John Adams in 1780 and is the oldest written constitution in the world, has paragraph after paragraph describing precisely the role that K-12 education is supposed to serve as the wellspring for our self-government and for our commonwealth, right? So the national government, the Founding Fathers, they left this completely silent. And that's not an accident. They wanted the decisions related to self-government owned and legally controlled and funded by the people that are connected to that work. Makes good sense, right? I'd argue that that arrangement of the national government doing the things that it can do well and the state governments doing the things that it can do well has basically taken this country from a loose collection of colonies along the eastern seaboard, and over 200 years has made us the most powerful country in the world. I mean, it's no small accomplishment. You can't name another country in the world that has enjoyed this kind of success and prosperity that was not inevitable, right? It took leadership. It took knowledge of history. It took a constitution that understood the best ways to organize human beings, right? And again, this arrangement served us well, and it was reflected in our schools, too. They always understood that public schooling was supposed to be this wellspring. If we were going to be self-governing citizens, that our students and our citizens had to be educated in the principles of our republic, about the founding documents, about human nature, about the things that bind us together as human beings. They had to understand these things because you wanted your neighbors to be well-educated enough to cast votes intelligently, right? Way. And this carried us well, really, until a little bit after World War II. But after World War II, we began to see some slippage. The country was largely recognized as being one of the highest performing countries in the world in terms of K-12 education. But in 1957, and many of you may remember it, I don't, but many of you do, was Sputnik. It was when the Soviet Union launched the first satellite into orbit. And they did it before us, and it really initiated the space race. And it began to occur to us, we were falling behind. We were falling behind our political rival, the Soviet Union, but we were also likely to be falling behind economically. It wasn't immediately apparent because the country had lots of advantages after World War II. Economy was booming. We were a big creditor nation. The rest of the nations, major industrialized countries in the world, were decimated by war. And we were sitting at the peak. But the thing about a peak is you can be on the top and you can also be beginning to head down the other side. And what the evidence was getting clearer and clearer is that we were losing our edge. And this was really the narrative around K-12 education from the late 50s, really until dramatically in 1983. There was a report that was published by the U.S. Department of Education under President Reagan, and it was called The Nation at Risk. And what this report in 1983 said was, if we had the system of public education that we had, enforced on us by a foreign adversary, it would be an act of war. We were losing ground. We were losing our economic competitiveness. We were losing our knowledge of our history and the central elements of our democracy that was going to be very, very problematic. But what that report did not do was come up with lots of top-down prescriptions from Washington, D.C. on how to solve these problems. Because everybody across the political spectrum, liberals, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, everybody knew what I mentioned earlier, is that there are limits on what the federal government could do in terms of K-12 education. So during the 80s, there was a variety of different you'd create among schools, and the parents and students would have this that would improve things. What began to really develop was a core group of people in Washington, D.C., and some of them are connected now with the Common Core, that really said the way to fix this is a one-size-fits-all set of national standards, tests, and curriculum that will be uniform across all of the states, right? What Massachusetts did in 1993 as their response to it was not only unique across the country, but it has proven to be historically successful. And I want to just tell you a little bit about that because it helps you understand why Common Core is going to be a problem for this state. So in 1993, it was a very, very unique moment. We had Bill Weld, who was a moderate to liberal Republican governor, and then we had a guy named Tom Birmingham, who, a pretty liberal Democrat from Chelsea, great relationship with organized labor. Mark Roosevelt, also pretty liberal Democrat, great relationship with organized labor. And I mentioned their party affiliation not to be partisan, but to say it was unique, because what happened is that these three guys got together and they crafted the landmark 1993 Education Reform Act. And what was in that Education Reform Act was not only good politics, but it was good policy. And what they decided to do is that they were going to make a minimum threshold that all communities across the state had to spend based on their ability to spend, right? So the wealthier communities were going to have to, have a higher threshold, and the poorer communities a lower one, right? But what they were also going to do is they were going to couple it together with a massive infusion of state dollars too. And they were going to be putting an enormous amount of money, particularly in the poor, low-performing districts. The cities, New Bedford, Fall River, Chelsea, Lawrence, Holyoke, Springfield, right? Very, very progressive funding formula. In exchange for this massive infusion of money, and we've spent over $100 billion, that's billion with a B, in the last 20 years at the state and local level. In exchange for the money, we were going to do all the hard things that really hadn't been happening in K-12 education, not just in Massachusetts, but across the country in the previous decades. We were going to have a refocusing of the academic work of schools on the basics of English, math, science, and history. We weren't going to do fuzzy math. We weren't going to do self-esteem. We weren't going to do soft skills. We weren't going to do workforce training. Generally speaking, the outlook of it was going to be on academics, the basics. Focus on the basics. You're going to be fortunate enough to hear from Sandy Stotsky, who was the prime mover and the architect behind those standards, a little later. So lots of money, high quality academic standards in the basics, teacher testing, so the teachers are going to be held to the same high academic standards that the students were going to be. MCAS testing. They want to make sure that the graduation diploma meant something, that the kids could read it when they were graduating, and that there were going to be high stakes connected to it. So you had to pass the MCAS, and you folks probably all know about the MCAS, in order to graduate from high school. We're going to have some charter schools to inject some school choice into it. So it's an incredibly complicated law that has led to remarkable, remarkable gains. Sandy can talk to you a lot more about the standards, but I'm going to give you sort of the impressionistic, the big picture of them. Deep commitment to classic literature, poetry, and drama, right? So things like Huckleberry Finn, Charles Dickens, Sherlock Holmes, Edith Wharton, high-quality novels, poetry, and drama. Why does this matter? It matters because the quality of the vocabulary found in those kinds of books are better than what you're going to find in, generally speaking, what they call informational text or nonfiction. You're going to have to read between the lines. You're going to have to learn about tragedy and comedy, and you're going to have to learn how to appreciate friendship and compassion. When you read Huckleberry Finn, you learn about the relationship between Huck, a runaway orphan, and Jim, a runaway slave. You're learning about friendship. You're learning about the kinds of things that bind us together as human beings. Help generating the kinds of citizens that you want to share your community with. Right? This is the important feature of it. It's not just that they're old books or good books. They teach our children how to be human. They teach them about the things that bind us together as human beings. And it matters. It matters enormously. And it matters because of their academic performance. Because, as I mentioned, the vocabulary is better. And the kinds of reading tests that they're going to be expected to have are based on better quality vocabulary and more complicated texts. Okay? On the math side, Massachusetts emulated the East Asian countries and some of the best practices from California, which had very high mathematics standards. And what 15,000 pieces of research demonstrate is that you have to have access to Algebra 1 in the 8th grade. If you have access to Algebra 1 in the 8th grade, it gives you enough room in high school, so if your kids want to study the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, that you can have pre-calculus, calculus, and trigonometry, if that's the route you want to go. But you've got to start early enough. And we did that in Massachusetts. Okay? So very high quality academic standards on the English side, very high quality academic standards on the math side. So what are the results? We've been 20 years into this project, had bipartisan support, we've spent $100 billion or more. What are the results? Well, while the rest of the country has still been on this nation at risk, stagnation and decline, Massachusetts has basically gone from a middle-of-the-pack state to #1 in the country and internationally competitive. There's a test called the NAEP test. It's the National Assessment of Educational Progress. It's the nation's report card. It's administered every couple years. Every state in the union takes it. It's been around for 30 or 40 years. No state in the history of that test has been #1 in every grade tested and every category tested. In 2005, guess what state did it? Massachusetts, right? It's an enormous accomplishment. Taxpayers, teachers, principals, school committee members, superintendents. I mean, it's a remarkable, remarkable accomplishment. And we did that again in 2007, 2009, 2011, 2013. So no state had ever done it once, and we've done it 5 times in a row. So I say that it's the equivalent of winning 5 World Series in a row and winning it in 4 straight games each time. Mind-boggling. But that Nation at Risk report in 1983 was very, very clear. To compete in the 21st century, you've got to be able to compete with Hong Kong and Singapore and South Korea and Japan and Germany, these really, really high-performing countries. So in 2007, Massachusetts tested as its own individual country on a test called the TIMSS test. It's the gold standard of international math and science testing. And that 2000 TIMSS testing illustrated is that our 8th graders were tied for #1 in the world in science. And we were among the top 3 or 4 in the world in mathematics in both 4th and 8th grade. Again, remarkable accomplishment. And then they did the same thing in 2013 on that same test. Now, having this success on the nation's report card, the NAEP test, is like winning 5 World Series. The success on the TIMSS is like winning Olympic gold medals. Okay? Remarkable. So that's the good news. The bad news is that starting in about 2006, 2007, the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers and what they call the Beltway Bandits, or the DC Blob, is what they call these players, these sort of trade groups that have been kicking around Washington, D.C. for decades. They haven't improved student achievement anywhere. They can't cite one place where they've actually improved student achievement in the last 20, 25 years. They decided that we need to fix the problems for the country. We've got to have national standards. So they began to develop Common Core. And they are private trade organizations. They're out of the purview of public scrutiny. So if you want to do a Freedom of Information Act search about the people that own and have the copyright on the Common Core standards, guess what? They don't have to comply with your Freedom of Information Act search. They don't have to tell you anything about how much money they spent developing the standards, who developed the standards, what was the process for the selection of those people. They don't have to tell you anything because they own those standards, okay? Then what happened is that there was the stimulus package that came down in 2009. There was no national debate about whether we're going to have national standards or tests or curriculum. There were no bills filed in Congress. There were no hearings or discussion. Baked into the stimulus package in 2009, they put a program called Race to the Top. And the Race to the Top gave the U.S. Department of Education and the Secretary of Education discretion over $4.3 billion. So he set up a contest called Race to the Top. Well, here in Massachusetts, we already knew that the race to the top was really the race to become Massachusetts. And everybody else knew that. The advocates of Common Core knew this too. They always knew they had to have Massachusetts. They had to have Massachusetts, because if Massachusetts adopt, and they're internationally competitive, and we're best in the country, what can like Mississippi or Alabama or Arkansas or New Mexico, the real low-performing states, they can't say no, right? So what happened is that the Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers worked with the U.S. Department of Education to bake in this Race to the Top contest, states having to sign on to the Common Core and to national testing as a condition for getting a portion of the $4.3 billion. Well, in the summer of 2010, Massachusetts adopted the Common Core. When everyone else was at the beach and barbecuing and having a good time, that's when the Patrick administration, that's when the State Board of Education thought it was a good idea to make a decision about changing tracks from the proven standards that had led to all these historic successes to the unproven Common Core. So Pioneer Institute, where I work, is an independent think tank, right? I mean, even our critics will say, we don't carry water for anybody, okay? We thought that given Massachusetts had the most to lose, that we ought to take a look at the quality of these standards. So we got Dr. Stotsky, we got Jim Milgram, a professor of mathematics at Stanford University. He's an internationally respected mathematician. He also worked on the very high quality math standards in California. We coupled them together with a guy named Zev Werman, who's a Silicon Valley engineer, also had been very active in math standards development in California. And we had these three researchers look at the academic quality of Common Core against high standard states like Massachusetts and Indiana and Texas and Minnesota and California. And they did these exhaustive 40, 50-page crosswalks going back and forth, comparing the standards in the Common Core drafts against the standards that we have in those high-performing states. And guess what they found? They found that, in fact, this was not going to be a race to the top. For high-standard states like Massachusetts, this was going to be a race to the middle. They pointed out that Common Core in English language arts or in reading was going to be ignoring the evidence from Massachusetts and going to cut classic literature and poetry and drama. So the reason why our kids are number one in the world, number one in the country in reading at every grade tested over 5 years is the commitment to classic literature, poetry, and drama. Common Core cuts that. So no Huckleberry Finn, no Sherlock Holmes, no Charles Dickens, no higher quality classic literature, right? They cut that, right? On the math side, they also ignored the evidence, not only from Massachusetts, not only from California, but all the East Asian countries, and decided to push forward access to Algebra 1, not in the 8th grade, the way everyone knows is the way to go, but you're going to have it in late 9th or early 10th grade. Then they're going to use an experimental form of geometry that has never been successful in any place it's been tried. And it's going to really top out at what Professor Milgram calls Algebra 2 Light. So if your child is interested in the STEM field, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, Common Core is really a path to nowhere, right? But don't take my word for it or Jim Milgram's word for it. I'm going to read you some lines from the people that were the advocates for this and the people that helped develop them. So this is Jason Zimba. He was the chief architect of the math standards for the Common Core. This is what he said, and you can look this up. Sandy Stotsky debated him on the Board of Ed in 2010. So if you just Google Jason Zimba with a Z, Mass Board of Ed, you'll see a video pop up. It's a couple of minutes, and it's even more telling than this quote. But this is what Mr. Zimba said. Jason Zimba, a lead architect and writer for the Common Core math standards, said that they prepare students for, quote, for the colleges most kids go to, but not for the colleges most parents aspire to, and added that the standards are, quote, not for selective colleges. So if you want to send your kid to a really good school, these aren't the standards for you. Bill McCallum, mathematician from University of Arizona. He too was one of the co-authors of the Common Core math standards. This is what he told PARCC in California in 2010. Quote, the overall standards would not be too high, certainly not in comparison to other nations, including East Asia, where math education excels, end quote. Got one more. Well, I think that will suffice. So it's not just the people that are opposed to it. Those are the people that wrote them in their own words and publicly have acknowledged that these are not very good. They're not very good standards. Okay, so the first piece of research that we looked at was the academic quality, because that's where conversations about standards begin and end. What's the quality? What's the quality of what my kid's going to be taught? Right? And what we're saying is they're not very good. Right? The next piece of research that we looked at was the legality, because I mentioned at the beginning. The fact is that there are laws that prohibit the federal government from funding or directing or validating or supporting national standards testing and curriculum. So we enlisted the former general counsel and deputy general counsel at the U.S. Department of Education under the second Bush administration, two highest ranking lawyers in the federal government in the past administration. And what they mapped out in lawyerly detail is that there are 3 federal laws that prevent the feds from doing what they've done under both Race to the Top and funding the PARCC. And those laws are the Elementary and Secondary Education Act of 1965, signed by Lyndon Johnson. There's the General Education Provisions Act of 1970, signed by Richard Nixon, and the enabling legislation that set up the U.S. Department of Education itself, which was signed in 1979 by Jimmy Carter. So 2 of the 3 presidents that signed these federal laws were Democrats. This is not a partisan issue, folks. It's not a partisan issue. It's a legal issue, right? And it's very, very clear. The feds are not supposed to be funding or directing or validating national standards or testing and curriculum. This is precisely what they've done. But it's not just our opinion. George Will is one of the best respected syndicated columnists over the last 30 years in this country. He's done several columns on it, one of them citing our research, essentially saying that the U.S. Department of Education is brushing aside federal laws that prohibit them from doing what it is that they want to do. The next piece of research we took a look at is the cost. Because even though 40-some-odd states have adopted, the reality of it is that only a handful of those states have done any kind of cost projection, what's going to cost the states and localities to implement it, because they're going to pay for it. The $250 million that we got through Race to the Top was over 4 years. That money's gone. If you do the math, it's basically over 4 years, we got 1 million students. It's basically about 33 cents per kid per day. That barely covers milk. It's not going to cover the cost of this, right? And the long and the short of it is that our projection is that it's going to cost the Commonwealth about $350 million to implement what are demonstrably lower quality standards. It's going to be $16 billion nationally. So there's a variety of other issues around it which we can get at during the Q&A, but there's an enormous amount of pushback going on across the country. The fact is, the more parents and legislators and people in the general public find out about it, the less happy they are about it. And the solutions to this, on the short term here, make your voice known to Governor Baker and the Secretary of Education and the Department of Education. Because all of this stuff gets locked in if we go and go over to the PARCC. It will all get locked in and it will not be able to get undone.